Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the 24th installment of Encyclopedia Hermetica, A Big History. I've entitled this talk, Atoms in the Void, and for good reasons. Our man of the hour today is the great and underrated Democritus, the so-called Laughing Philosopher. Quite some time ago, we spoke about Heraclitus, the great Weeping Philosopher, and now it's time to turn that frown upside down. There's an old Buddhist saying that says, "From the void compassion comes." And I think that our old materialist would have said the same thing. This explains his title, The Laughing Philosopher. So, from what little we know, despite being the founder of a belief system that some would assume leads its adherents down destructive and nihilistic paths, the picture of Democritus comes down through history of a man who seemed to have been ever cheerful, always ready to see the glass as half full, proverbially speaking. Now, before I start, I'll give this caveat. It's been a mistake on my part, chronologically speaking, to talk about Aristotle before talking about Democritus, since it's the latter who had influence on the former. But these things happen when you're dealing with a subject as vast as our own, and ultimately, in the grand scheme of things, the mistake is negligible. Now, if you remember back to the lectures I gave on Plato and the Sophists, you'll recall that I brought up this idea that there is a, and I stress the indefinite article here, quote-unquote, official history of philosophy, the likes of which you'd learn in a generic ancient philosophy college class or from an average textbook. Then, on the other hand, we have what Michel Onfray calls une contre-histoire de la philosophie, a counter-history of philosophy. Again, stressing a counter-history, not the counter-history. This is the type of thing that you'd only uncover through your own directed studies if you were so inclined toward the subject. Now, obviously, there are more than just two perspectives from which we can study the history of philosophy, but reconciling these two branches seems good enough for our purposes. I should quickly mention here in passing, if ever you pick up a book that proclaims itself to be the history on a particular subject, that should actually be your deciding factor as to whether you're going to invest time into reading it. They say, never judge a book by its cover, but I say don't read the history of anything. There's no such thing. And any historian worth his salt should know better. There are only many histories. Now, this doesn't mean that there is no one single reality, as in that which has undergone the formality of actually occurring, but whether that can be entirely distilled into words while giving a full account for all parties involved is a whole other issue. In any case, I digress. So, this counter-history, what's its whole deal? Well, I've discussed this in some detail before, but it's worth reiterating the concept. The idea of a counter-history arose from the concept that the history of philosophy that most of us learn in school is largely oriented around a sort of Socratean messianic model, centered upon the narrative passed down primarily through the Platonic tradition, that is, through a handful of schools of ancient thought which stood in opposition to the materialistic, atomistic, and hedonistic tradition. Now, when I say hedonist, I'm not talking about Hedonbot from Futurama. We're not talking about reckless abandon to one's every lusts here. A true hedonist knew that excessive pleasure led to pain and was therefore not pleasure. I simply mean that at the end of the day, this school of thought held to the assumption that the pursuit of pleasure, hedone in Greek, and the absence of pain, ataraxia, were the highest goods in life. And they would argue that these goods were ultimately what the Platonists and the Christians wanted as well, despite what they said through all their metaphysical postulations of interworlds and worlds beyond ours and this and that. There's long been this idea that a hedonist can't be a philosopher and a philosopher can't be a hedonist. But this is obviously because the mainstream history of philosophy favors the dualist, therefore ascetic side of things. Another label for this view is eudaimonism, meaning the good life-ism, or being of good mind-ism. This was a philosophy with an eye toward the present, rather than the future or the past. The present is all we actually have, so let's work with that. Now, the reason for this bifurcation in the history of philosophy is simple, and it's on account of the fact that Christianity had ultimately emerged as one of many Gnostic sects in the 1st century AD, and these sects were essentially the bastard children of a Hellenized, therefore Platonized, Judaism. Over the centuries, Christianity subsumed the Platonic tradition and then ran everyone else out of business. This hedonist or eudaimonist position had long become the customary belief system of upper-class educated Roman pagans, and one by one they died off, or were pressured to relinquish their ideals for mostly political reasons. Then, long after Christianity had risen to supremacy over the Roman Empire, and lay literacy had largely ground to a halt, it had become the task of Christian monks to copy manuscripts and ensure the survival and reproduction of important Western texts. Now, these monks copied all manner of texts, but this entire process was very slow and very costly. If you're interested in this, look up how a codex of vellum is made. You'll see it's essentially the process of condensing a small farm between two covers. For this reason, the monks couldn't just copy and pass down every single text brought to them from pagan antiquity. They had priorities, least of which was pleasing historians and archivists 1,000 years down the line. No. What they needed were psalters, books of psalms from the Old Testament, and lots of them. Remember, this is what monks did for a living, ora et labora, prayer and work, and when they regularly got together to pray, they did so by singing the Old Testament psalms. So these psalm books got used every day, many times a day, and so were a hot commodity throughout the entire Middle Ages. Someone brings you a manuscript with Cicero on it? Oh, well, who cares? He was a pagan anyways, so let's scrape the ink off the page and turn this into a psalter. True story, by the way. So, you see, over the centuries, the abbots of European monasteries were the chief deciders of what information was valuable to mankind and what information was not. Did it pertain to the salvation of our immortal souls? No? Okay, well, let's replace it with something that does. By and large, and this is not a blanket statement, it was the works of Aristotle which were co-opted and believed to be of most value to the church until the works of Plato were rediscovered during the Renaissance, which, I should add, were actually translated after the Corpus Hermeticum because it was thought to be of less importance. Mind you, I think this is more of a testament to Hermeticism's importance rather than a testament to Plato's lack of importance. Well, anyhow, seeing as how most of Plato didn't even make it through the Middle Ages, well, not in the Latin West at least, he was doing fine and dandy over in the Arabic world, then what chance do we think Democritus could have had in surviving that level of intellectual erosion over the centuries? I mean, Plato was foundational to many concepts inherent to Christianity, and even he hardly made the cut. Now, it's safe to say that both Socrates and Plato were well acquainted with the ideas that Democritus had put forward. They would have been impossible to ignore at the time. One thing, however, is for sure. Plato never mentioned Democritus. Not even a passing mention. He wrote all sorts of dialogues with Socrates philosophically crushing all manner of straw-man sophists, but he passes over Democritus in complete silence. I think this silence speaks volumes, and so it seems that on account of Plato being silent, the rest of history followed suit. If we take a look at the sheer volume of scholarship that's been done on Democritus in relation to the other pre-Socratics, we'll find that it's virtually nothing. One is very, very tempted to believe, as Michel Onfray believes, that Plato expressly remained disengaged from conversation with Democritus, either because he knew he couldn't win in an argument if push came to shove, or because he flat out dismissed atomic materialism as the ultimate delusion, the sign of a thoroughly corrupt soul lost within a cave of illusions. So, for this, and possibly for other reasons as well, Democritus was largely ignored in ancient Athens. Democritus himself is quoted as saying, "I came to Athens and no one knew me." A clue to this puzzle lies in a reference in Diogenes Laertius's Lives and Opinions of Eminent Philosophers, Book 9, Chapter 40. Quote, Aristoxenus, in his historical notes, affirms that Plato wished to burn all the writings of Democritus that he could collect. End quote. Now, one of the reasons we actually know anything at all about Democritus is thanks to his fellow northern-born philosopher, Aristotle. Democritus was born in Abdera, which is in Thrace, just northeast of the Greek mainland, not far from where Aristotle was born. So, Aristotle had a much more sober view of Democritus's ideas than Plato did. Doubtless, this had a huge role to play in his doctrine of hylomorphism, and I think that ultimately this had a very positive influence on the history of science, both immediately and in the long run. In the long run, the materialistic, atomistic vision of the world would become the federal opposition of sorts to the more idea-centric philosophies. It's the root of Marxism. It's a little-known fact that Marx wrote his dissertation on the difference between Democritus's and Epicurus's thought, and this is how materialism became the cornerstone of his radical economic theories. Atomism is at the root of nihilism, and at the root of existentialism, which are both points of view that religiously oriented idealists have tried to repress for the last 150 years. So, inasmuch as there is a long lineage of philosophers that descend from the line of Plato, there's also a long lineage of philosophers who saw things quite differently in the line of Democritus. As per usual, I will not make the judgment as to which school is better, but one thing is for sure. It's the former school which has been responsible for suppressing the latter school throughout history, not the other way around. I'm not saying that some sort of reverse persecution could be on its way. Some believe it's already here, but it's definitely within the realm of possibility. Now, let's actually talk about our man for a bit, and then we can have some more context for all this craziness. Democritus, Greek Democritos, whose name means chosen of the people, and whose dates are circa 460 to 370 BC, was an ancient Greek philosopher, mathematician, and world traveler. Erroneously considered a pre-Socratic, despite the fact that he and Socrates were contemporaries, and he outlived the Athenian martyr by some 20 years. By his own words, quote, "I was young when Anaxagoras was old." Now, what made Democritus famous, and he was certainly more famous in the ancient world than he is in our own world, it was this formulation of an atomic theory of the universe. Now, before you get too excited and start retroprojecting all sorts of nonsense, let's look at what he actually meant by the word atoma. The word atom in Greek is a combination of the verb to cut and the privative alpha, implying a thing which cannot be cut. Democritus, along with his mentor Leucippus, were the first Greeks we know of to postulate an entire materialistic conception of the world, a world made up purely of particles falling through the void. Now, whoever was the first atomist, we'll probably never know. Whether he was Greek or not, we'll never know. What we do know, however, is that the earliest Greek materialist, believing that everything in the universe was essentially an accident, was much unlike Aristotle or Plato in his or her worldview. The atomists wanted to begin with direct experience. They wanted to rationalize the world with what they could observe without recourse to things like purpose, a prime mover, or final causes. These are all things that we've been talking about over the past few lectures. Now, the atomists held to the belief that questions pertaining to nature should be answered by simple, mechanistic explanations. What were the circumstances before this happened that caused this event? Democritus is famously quoted for stating that he'd rather discover causality than to become the king of Persia. Now, what the Platonists and the Aristotelians were concerned with was the quest for explanations which, on top of the material mechanistic stuff, also included the formal and teleological stuff. So the question they asked was, for what purpose did this thing serve? I suppose I should mention that despite Democritus's single-minded focus on cause, he never got around to explaining what the first cause was. He ran into the same problem most materialists still run into now, the problem of, quote, "Give me one free miracle and I'll explain to you the rest," as Terence McKenna so aptly put it. Now, I should add that this is only a problem if you think it's a problem. It isn't really necessary that the universe has a cause if it's just always been. Asking a question like, what was before the Big Bang, is like asking what's north of the North Pole. The Greeks didn't posit that the void came from anything, nor would it seem right to do so under any circumstances. And then on the flip side, they also didn't posit that the atom necessarily came from anything either. In this mode of thinking, the atom exists as a sort of antiparticle to the void, as we'll explore in a bit, the one being necessary to the other's existence. So, with that said, probably the reason Democritus never went prodding around for an initial cause is because he intuited an infinite regression of causes, and he figured it was futile to try to find out how far this regression spanned. Alright, so I think it goes without saying that Democritus was a reductionist. He wanted to strip it all away, down to its bare essence, to see the thing and explain it for what it was without positing all sorts of extra intellectual baggage. and for this reason his philosophy was quite simple, though not simple-minded. Now, it's my personal opinion that reductionism is an intellectual error. These days you have all sorts of people running around saying, oh, it's all just chemicals, or it's all just this or that. And in response, I always say that just is the dirtiest word in the English language. When you say this universe is just this, or just that let's say love is just this, or just that, or that virtue is just this, or just that, you've already made a statement that it is not its opposite, when in reality, the world is a delicate and never-ending dance between opposites. You know, the world is a cold and dark place, until it's not. Nature is mute, until it's not. Words are meaningless, until they're not. Do you see what I mean? So, with that being said, my own cards are now on the table. I'm not a materialist or a reductionist in any way, but that doesn't mean that we can't learn a whole lot from them, and that I can't try to represent their ideas fairly and glint some truth from them. In fact, I think the idea of big history, or world history in general, is a reductionistic process. It just strangles out all of the other variables in order to create a really big linear narrative. But if we play with our focus, we switch up our lenses, and we look at things from a number of perspectives, we can learn a whole lot. So, moving on. Given the scarcity of sources on Democritus, his exact contributions are quite hard to disentangle from those of his mentor Leucippus, as they're often mentioned together in the literature. From what little we know, Leucippus seems to have flourished around the year 440 BC in the city-state of Miletus on the Ionian coast, that is on the modern-day Turkish side of the Greek world. Now, it's no surprise that the first atomist was from the land of the rationalist Physikoi. His approach to philosophy was very much at one with the spirit of the times. If we had to posit one of the so-called pre-Socratics as having had the biggest influence on Leucippus and Democritus, we'd probably have to go with Parmenides, but that isn't to say that others didn't have an influence as well. Atomism ultimately arose out of the conflict between the one and the many, between the monists and the pluralists. This is a conflict we've discussed in some detail. Atomism was a means of reconciling the Parmenidean, and subsequently the Platonic view, and the Empedoclean or Heraclitean view. Leucippus and Democritus's speculations about a purely material world would eventually find many parallels in 19th century conceptions of atomic structure. And this has led some folks to regard Democritus as more of a scientist than other Greek philosophers, but this isn't exactly fair. Democritus might be more correct than others in some regards, but he didn't come to his conclusions through the scientific method, and so it isn't fair to call him a scientist in the strict modern sense of the word. I think it was Bertrand Russell who said that Democritus's hypothesis was essentially a lucky guess, and this guess was as good as anyone's. His estimations just happened to be very keen, and thus bore similarity to our own modern conceptions of the world. Now, obviously, we can't reproach the man for not having imagined things like protons, neutrons, electrons, quarks, gluons, bosons, and all that Baroque goodness, but this would be a serious violation of the historian's craft. We should instead praise the man for coming up with a vision of the world that is totally coherent and reasonable, provided we've decided to start hacking away at the problem from our senses as a starting point. It's amazing to consider what a man could achieve without the help of sophisticated equipment, abundant resources, laboratories, and complex facilities. He did all of this by his senses alone. Now, like most philosophers, Greek or otherwise, Democritus was born to a wealthy noble family, that is, wealthy enough that his father could receive the Persian Emperor Xerxes on his march through Thrace during his campaign against Greece. A courtly magus named Ostones, who was accompanying Xerxes on campaign, was said to have taught Democritus a thing or two. Throughout his whole life, he was a brilliant mathematician. After his father passed away, in good philosophical tradition, Democritus spent his father's inheritance on travels into distant lands where he might satisfy his thirst for knowledge. He traveled along the highways and byways of the Persian Empire, and he was even alleged to have reached as far as India and Ethiopia. We know he wrote about Babylon and Meroe, and likewise lived in Egypt for a few years. Democritus himself claimed that among his contemporaries, nobody had undertaken greater journeys, visited more foreign lands, and met with more scholars than he did. Theophrastus, Aristotle's successor, who I mentioned last lecture, also spoke of him as a man who was well-traveled. Democritus was particularly fond of the Egyptian mathematicians, whose knowledge Pythagoras had so deeply imbibed, and it's interesting to think that a man like Democritus and a man like Pythagoras, both widely traveled, both versed in the wisdom of the Chaldeans, the Persians, and the Egyptians, and both so fond of mathematical truths, it's interesting that these two men would ultimately come to two such radically and yet subtly different conceptions of the world. One rooted in matter, and the other rooted in ideal, yet both rooted in monads. Now, upon his return to Greece, Democritus busied himself with natural philosophy, with what we'd call in the modern world more scientific endeavors. He took to exploring Greece in order that he might acquire a more profound knowledge of its peoples. He made a career of writing and publishing, and the profits he made from that he put toward buying more books and then writing more of his own. Apparently, he was even friends with Hippocrates, the famous Greek physician, after whom was named the Hippocratic Oath, a nice vow in the Asclepian cult tradition that doctors still take today. So, we've seen what sort of vibrant life our wanderer Democritus led. Well, what else is there to know? Most anecdotes about Democritus, especially in Diogenes Laertius, paint the picture of a modest, simple, and scholarly man. A man who advocated the simple life. Now, this brings me to a brief point of interest that I want to raise. It seems that all philosophers, whether realists or idealists, monists or dualists, Easterners or Westerners, whatever they might be, it seems that they all have this one notion in common: the importance of a simple life. Monks, priests, and ascetics mutilate and starve themselves. Princes, lords, and emperors grow fat on excess. The monk is dressed in rags. The bishop is decked in gold. The priest has nothing better to do than to pry into other people's business. The king obsesses over news from his domain. The philosopher, however, eats when he's hungry, drinks when he's thirsty. He typically wears simple clothes, but not so simple as to draw attention. He busies himself with ideas rather than local gossip or irrelevant news. He is honored by the esteem he receives from others, but he doesn't crave it. The philosopher is not averse to wealth, but he is wary of greed. He walks the middle path, to use the Buddhist terminology. The great maxim, "Nothing in excess," is written on his heart. It doesn't matter if we're talking about Hesiod, Siddhartha, Pythagoras, Plato, Epicurus, Democritus, Jesus, Plotinus, or whoever. The common denominator among all of them, regardless of their ideological hair-splitting, was that a simple life was the best life. The pursuit of pleasure in its extreme always has its backlash, and equally so the extreme avoidance of pain. Philosophers around the globe, across time, seem to agree on this. Now, while I'm on this tangent, I should probably mention that in one traditional account, probably apocryphal, but whether it actually happened is irrelevant, Democritus is said to have deliberately blinded himself so as to be less distracted from his intellectual pursuits. I personally find this doubtful and out of character for a guy like Democritus. I think probably what was more likely is that he lost his sight in old age, which of course was not unusual, especially for someone who spends their lives reading and writing by candlelight. Democritus lived to a very old age, and so the likeness of a man keeping his sight intact for most of his life is quite dim. Alright, well, that's enough about Democritus's personal life. Let's turn over and see what his actual ideas were. I want to break this down slowly so that I can show you the logic Leucippus and Democritus used to come to their conception of the world. If you take a second to think about what the Parmenidean school actually preached, you'll remember that they believed in this grand one thing. The monad. Eternal, indivisible, and without cause. Well, think carefully. Eternal, indivisible, without cause. Other than the universe itself as a whole, what does this sound like we're talking about? Well, it sounds like we're describing an atom, at least as far as the ancients were concerned. What Leucippus did, and Democritus by extension, was take this idea of a philosophical atom, the monad, the one great thing, undivided, the howling aum. They took this and then they started making copies of it. They envisioned a world where the one is the many. On the one hand, they conceded to the Parmenidean school, everything is monadic. And then they turned around and they gave a wink to the pluralists and said, but there are an infinite number of monads, and they are small, very, very small. They're in us and they're all around us. So the official Democritean position may be summed up in the following 4 propositions. So here they are. 1. Everything that we call reality is composed of either atoms or the spaces between atoms. Even the gods are made of atoms. 2. Atoms are eternal, indivisible, infinite in number, and homogeneous in nature. All differences in bodies are due to a difference in the size, shape, or location of the atoms. 3. There is no purpose or design in nature, and in this sense, all is ruled by chance. 4. All activity is reduced to local motion. So, in this way, what we've got is atoms falling through a void. The arrangement of the universe as we know it exists on account of the fact that the larger atoms fall faster, and then these larger atoms strike against the smaller ones to create all sorts of combinations. Now, in contrast to our modern quantum mechanical conception of atoms, which are thought to interact via electric and magnetic force fields, Democritus's atom was purely inert, and it interacted with other particles mechanically. We'll get back to this. The whole universe, then, was conceived as the result of some great and accidental concourse of atoms. There was no transcendental world beyond our own. There was naught but matter. There could be no vertical ascent to transcendence, since nothing exists outside the immanent. They saw the cosmos as a sort of horizontal playing field. You can probably see why Platonists and church fathers alike would, at best, talk a lot of shit, and at worst, pass over this notion in silence. Worlds formed, worlds dissolved, some were beautiful and orderly, others were chaotic and senseless. To the materialist, there is no creator, no creation, nothing divine, nothing sacred, just pure being. So, later on in this series, we'll see how Epicurus will found a whole philosophy on Democritus's cosmology, but only after correcting this faulty notion, thanks to Aristotle, that larger atoms fall faster through the void than the smaller ones. Now, it's doubtful that I'll do a lecture on this, so I should add that atomism was the cornerstone to Lucretius's Latin epic De Rerum Natura, on the nature of things. After this, with the exception of a small number of alchemists throughout the Middle Ages, we find no extant representatives of this worldview until Pierre Gassendi, whose dates are 1592 to 1655. Gassendi wanted to harmonize atomism with Christianity by tweaking those 4 propositions I mentioned. He thought atoms instead to be finite in number and created by God rather than eternal. After this, as far as I know, it wasn't until the application of atomism to the study of the natural world that philosophical materialism was also revived. And this process would play a vital role in the scientific revolution of the 17th and 18th centuries. Alright, so we've spoken about the Democritian atom. But now, what about the other half of the coin? Remember, this whole thing is about atoms in the void. There is matter, and there is the empty spaces in between. Well, the atomist's hypothesis vis-à-vis the void was essentially a reactionary one. It was a response to the paradoxes of Parmenides and his disciple Zeno, the founders of metaphysical logic. As we've been discussing, Parmenides was the philosopher who believed in a sort of extreme monism, even more extreme than Plato's. As opposed to Heraclitus, Parmenides thought there was no change at all in the universe. That there was just one static, unchanging, and howling oneness. Now, to support this belief, his disciple Zeno put forth some pretty hard-nosed arguments in favor of this notion that, mathematically speaking, there can be no movement. The Parmenidean position held that any sort of movement would require a void. And what is a void ultimately? Well, it's nothing. But obviously this nothing can't exist. The Parmenidean position, the pleroma position, was this. Okay, so you're telling me that there is this void, and now since you're telling me about it, since we're talking about it, then clearly it can't be nothing, therefore there is no void. Now, this sort of view could be validated by the observation that where there seemed to be nothing, there was still air. Of course, folks at this time had no reason to see the forest for the trees. Nowadays, we know there's no such thing as a literal physical void, of course, because even the vacuum of empty space is pregnant with dark matter and light waves that relentlessly push back the event horizon. Anyhow, this is how the idea of the atom was born, as a reaction to this denial of void. The argument goes like this. This is Democritus' argument now. We have a void. And now we're talking about it. So it's got to be something. And that something is not nothing. So that something must be the atom, the monad, of which there are an infinite number filling up the vacuum. For every 0, there's a 1. For every non-being, there was being. Remember our Hermetic principle of polarity. We have atom and absence of atom. Atom being infinite in number, and vacuum being infinite in area. And inasmuch as these were infinite in number and extent, they were also both infinite in duration. They had no beginning, no purpose, and no end. Aristotle wrestled with this, and he couldn't accept the idea that everything had always been in motion. And so what he ultimately posited in trying to reconcile the atomistic and the Platonic position was that there was a sort of prime mover, and that he was co-eternal, albeit outside of that dyad of atom and void. This dyad became a triad then. Void, atom, and motion. What I like to imagine as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Now, before all of this was conceived, before Aristotle got his hand into the mix, the atomists all agreed that motion necessitated the existence of a void, but they simply ignored that old Parmenidean paradox that they were always accosted with, on the grounds that motion was an observable fact in the real world. What they really mean is in the sensory world. In their minds, no matter what the math said, Achilles catches the tortoise. Of course, we might add that they didn't have powerful enough microscopes to see that Parmenides and Zeno were actually right. I should point out that in reality, Achilles never actually catches the tortoise. There are only electromagnetic fields touching, not atoms themselves. So this sensation of contact is really an illusion. Our distance from one another is almost asymptotic. Now, obviously they couldn't have known this, so the atomists asserted that there really must be a void, regardless of what the Parmenideans said. And it's only by virtue of this vacuum between atoms that anything can actually happen in the universe. It wouldn't be until Einstein postulated his theory of relativity that we had real answers to Parmenides and Zeno's paradox, and this was with the idea that space itself is relative and not distinct from time. Instead, we've got this sort of curved space-time manifold. But anyways, we're getting ahead of ourselves. So the next thing we need to ask ourselves is this. If all is but atoms in the void, then how can we come to know anything? What is our atomist's epistemology? Well, here's a place where I come to disagreements with Democritus. Knowledge of truth, with a capital T, according to Democritus, was at best difficult to acquire, since everyone's perception through the senses is subjective, and at worst, impossible to acquire, because it laid in a sort of impenetrable abyss. Now, Democritus believed that since each individual experiences different impressions through the same sense organ, then we cannot discern what is true through mere sense impressions. Thus, we can only interpret sensory data through the intellect and then apply reason so as to grasp the truth, because this is where the truth lies hidden, lurking at the bottom of it all. So, all this I don't disagree with, but it's a mistake that he makes along the way as he rationalizes things that I have a problem with. Democritus wrote, and I quote, "Many other animals receive sense impressions contrary to our own, and even between different people, things do not always seem the same. So, which of these impressions are true and which are false? It's not obvious. For the one set is no more true than the other, but both are alike." End quote. So here's where I disagree. As the Tao Te Ching says, a wheel has 30 spokes, but only a single hub. Some of these spokes might be a lot weaker than others, some stronger. To say that it is not obvious which impressions are true and which impressions are false is to deny that there is actually a reality external to the senses, and to deny this, it's to deny this hub at the center of the wheel. Democritus seems to think that if a dog hears a threatening sound and a human hears the same sound, that we can't know whose perspective is more in line with reality. Well, the truth is that there is a reality outside of our perception. If a tree falls in the woods, and both a dog and a man are walking at some distance to this tree, the dog hears it loud and clear, but the man doesn't even seem to notice. Then who is it among the two who has a clearer understanding of that which underwent the formality of actually occurring? We don't say dogs have equal but different hearing or smell. We say that they have better senses, in that they give more accurate data about the world, relative though it be. Democritus says things are hot by convention, and that things are cold by convention, reiterating this idea that man is the measure of all things. But again, the truth is, there is an absolute zero. There's a point at 273 degrees Celsius below zero where things don't just feel cold, the atoms literally stop moving. Pitch darkness is not a matter of opinion. If there's no light entering into a place, then there's no light in that place. So you see, I don't know if it's just that I'm doing Democritus an injustice and misrepresenting him, but you can see why I disagree with our atomists' notions on epistemology. Now, all this being said, I need to be fair and say that Democritus did in fact divide knowledge into two parts. Knowledge which comes through the senses, and then knowledge which is deduced by reasoning. If any truth can be grasped at all, Democritus thought, then it's through this data processed by the intellect, not the raw data, which is often fallacious. Hopefully this reminds you a bit of the trivium that we discussed. In any case, Now that we've seen Democritus's cosmology, we should probably figure out what all this actually meant to Democritus insofar as ethics, morals, and personal development are concerned. Democritus was no nihilist. He was the Laughing Philosopher. Just because he lived in a vacuum full of atoms senselessly hurling around, it didn't mean that he just threw in the towel and did whatever the fuck he wanted without giving a shit about anybody else around him. Like I said at the beginning, Democritus would have held to this Buddhist notion that out from the void compassion comes. Our humanity to one another comes from empathy, not from God, he would have thought. We all want to live amidst one another's happiness, not amongst each other's misery. And so it stands to reason that he'd want to act ethically to maximize this aggregate happiness. So, in this regard, Democritus believed in equality, but not for slaves or women, of course, which probably meant that he didn't really care about equality at all. Or at least he only cared about it within the narrow confines which his culture and times dictated. If we consider that he wouldn't have believed in concepts like the polarity between good and evil, then we can't really blame him for this. Nevertheless, he held freedom above slavery, and he held democracy above tyranny. He didn't believe that money was evil, but like Jesus, he believed the love of wealth to be the root of all ills. Democritus disliked violence, but he didn't consider himself a pacifist. Now, of course, I don't think anyone living in the 4th century ever believed in pacifism. It was a truly bloody and senseless time, and nobody had the luxury of peace to pretend like they were pacifists as people do these days, particularly suburban folk. Untried virtue is not virtue. A monk who never leaves his cloister cannot boast of his chastity. In this way, a person who calls themselves a pacifist while living in the Western world during the 21st century doesn't mean much to me. The violence has been done. If it makes people feel better about themselves, I suppose I can't complain too much, but we'll never know how those people would really act if they lived in an era as brutal as the Hellenistic age, because in their lives, push will likely never come to shove. But I digress. That's my little rant about pacifism. Democritus understood the times he was living in, and he understood that sometimes war is necessary. Anger ought to be curtailed for the sole purpose that it clouded reason, which was a force of goodness in the world. Contentment could be achieved through a moderate and a measured life. We've got a latent prototypical theory of ataraxia at work here, which would become so important to Epicurus at a later date. When one lives in such troubled times, the highest good often becomes simply to be left alone. Even Plato's Republic, when all is said and done, was a manual for creating a society which would not achieve the greatest heights of art and technology, not provide the greatest level of happiness and freedom to the individual. No, it was just a manual for creating a society which could defend itself against its enemies. The Greek world, in the aftermath of the Persian Wars, in the aftermath of Athens' rise to power and the Peloponnesian War, it was deeply traumatized. Most individuals had doubtless seen at least one friend or family member who was claimed by war, plague, or slavery, so it's really not a surprise why the 5th and 4th centuries BC gave rise to so many intellectuals professing the goodness of being left alone and acting morally to improve the aggregate quality of life for everyone around. In addition to Democritian atomism and Epicureanism, we'll see a number of other avenues opening up for dealing with the really horrid spirit of the times. Stoicism, cynicism, skepticism, magic and superstition, mystery cults centered on soteriological figures. All of these things evolved in the wake of ever-increasing population density, ever-increasing improvements in communication and travel, and ever-increasing statewide conflicts. People started realizing that they need to be saved. Saved from themselves, saved from one another, and saved from the fickleness of Mother Nature. For those who believed in a soul, all of a sudden they started thinking that it needed to be saved. For those who believed in nothing but matter, well, the only hope there was for them was to save themselves. Some people looked inward for salvation, and then others looked outward. One thing is for sure, however. People started looking for a savior like never before, and this would come to rock the world in all manner of manifestations. And to these things will come in due time. Alright, so this is all I have to say about Democritus for the time being. That's the main body of the presentation for today. You'll have to forgive me because I'm about to get somewhat off topic. What I want to do now is talk for a few minutes and give you a sense about the book that I just published over at Amazon, which is on the topic of savior gods. It's entitled Shamanism and the Mysteries, a brief history of the cult of ecstasy. At the moment, it's only available on Kindle, and it's quite cheap. You should be able to find a link for it in the comments section. I spent a solid 2 years writing this book, so it's really crammed full of good information. The whole book hinges on the idea that the orgiastic rites of the Phrygian goddess, which you might know as Cybele, is but a continuation of Anatolia's indigenous and pre-agricultural shamanic traditions, which stretch back into the mists of time immemorial. The so-called mysteries were esoteric initiation ceremonies connected to annual agricultural and astrological cycles, essentially surviving forms of ancient rites of passage. And so, what I wanted to investigate was the customs of modern cultures who had preserved old ancestral shamanic traditions, such as those cultures of the Amazon basin and those of the Russian steppe. I did this primarily in order to demonstrate how similar traditional forms of shamanism are to the Phrygian rites as described by classical authors. Self-induced ecstasy, whether substance-related or not, was an integral part of the Greco-Roman religious landscape, and to highlight its importance, I discussed the myth, symbolism, and literature concerning the mysteries, and then I compare them by analogy with the anthropological data recorded concerning the shamanism of the Russian steppes. Both traditions are concerned with fasting, with dance, drumming, self-mutilation, incubation, and, as I argue, a tree-oriented ritual of cosmic ascent and the use of a hallucinogenic mushroom. In the book, I give a number of definitions relevant to shamanism, the most important being for the word ecstasy. Ecstasis, the state of standing entirely outside the body. I divide ecstasy into two separate types, an orgiastic form, where you've got outbursts of delirium poured out through vigorous physical activity, which is also accompanied by raving or prophesying, And then you've got a second form, which is a sort of paralytic trance brought about by incubation, wherein one is physically inert and sensible only to the hallucinations on the backdrop of one's own eyes. Although either state might occur spontaneously or through intense meditation, both of these forms of ecstasy can easily be, and were, induced by the ingestion of apt psychoactive substances. I discussed the recent scientific evidence published by Roland Griffiths at Johns Hopkins University on the, quote, mystical experience, proving that hallucinogenic mushrooms can indeed cause a clear-cut and scientifically defined mystical experience when used in a proper set and setting. If we read the personal testimonies of the patients who received the treatments from Dr. Griffiths, a good classicist might recall some interesting parallels between these modern accounts of visionary experience and those ancient accounts of individuals initiated at Eleusis. I try to give the notion that an encounter with a hallucinogenic substance can have the high potential for eliciting a life-changing experience, and it's these very types of experiences that initiates of shamanic initiation rites and members of antiquity's various mystery cults sought out. Throughout my research, I worked closely with the theory put forward by R. Gordon Wasson, that Russian shamans today have preserved an ancient tradition of ritual intoxication, which is described by the Vedic poets. And although these very well could have been parallel developments, I concede this, they also could have been directly linked through contact long ago in Central Eurasia, before the Aryan migrants descended into Iran and India, and when they lived in a state of cultural exchange with their northern neighbors, the Finno-Ugric people. In exploring this hypothesis, I present some linguistic evidence showing the tight relation between many core Indo-European words and their Uralic cognates. Most important among these are the Latin fungus and the Greek sphongos, the sponge, which are directly related to the specific Finno-Ugric name for Amanita muscaria, pongo. So, there's at least some degree of interculturation concerning fungi at an early date, lending weight to the theory put forward by Wasson. Across the two distinct language groups, there's also evidence of a single preparation method for the consumption of this Amanita muscaria mushroom that was shared from at least the Russian steppes down on through Iran and northern India. So, essentially, the whole book is a brief history of the goddess whom the Romans called Cybele, or Mater Deum Magna Idei, after the Greek title Megalameter, in addition to being a pretty thorough treatment of shamanism. I describe a process which unfurled over thousands of years in order that some local Phrygian mountain goddess might ultimately come to be known to foreign shores as the mother of all gods. I discussed the earliest known manifestation of the Anatolian Goddess, who was worshipped at Çatalhöyük between 7500 BC and 5700 BC. And then I discussed how the iconography of the matronly woman enthroned and flanked by lions survived well through the Phrygian, Greek, and Roman cultures. This is evidence that the Greeks and the Romans consciously venerated a goddess older than all of their own gods, and they did so with ecstatic rites. I'm not implying that any one culture from antiquity ever practiced some sort of fully preserved and perfected Neolithic cult, but that the relative consistency across the Mediterranean for all goddess-oriented mystery rites seems to suggest that they all share one common ancestor. Among the Greeks, hallucinations, madness, trance, fits of epilepsy, dreams, and the sense of psychological abandon were all in the domain of Mater. By nature, she was tightly associated with the Greek intoxication god Dionysus, and in the works as early as Euripides' Bacchae, we begin to see a very distinct theme of Bacchus being the chief initiator of the Phrygian mother's rites. So I give a detailed account for the history of both the Greek Dionysus and the so-called Phrygian Attis, his cognate. I identify them as both embodiments of the archetypal pharmakos, the drugged scapegoat who must be ritually sacrificed at the heart of the mysteries for the good of the community. This pattern of intoxicated human sacrifice can be found interwoven throughout many myths regarding the Phrygian mother, and I describe these in a few chapters. The most intact and detailed version of Attis's passion comes down to us through Arnobius of Sicca in his case against the pagans. I don't have the time to discuss all the myths here, but what's important is that it contains all the chief themes of the goddess's rites. Divine incest, plant births, madness, mountaintops, kings, frenzied music, the sacred marriage, or hieros gamos, castration, human sacrifice, self-mutilation, sacred trees, and a cycle of annual death and rebirth. I tried to flesh out the details of the Phrygian mother's rites. I discussed a number of authors' accounts concerning Dionysiac or Great Mother festivals, testimonies of mystery initiates themselves, and then even Euripidean tragedies. Then I outlined the parallels between them and the spring festivals in honor of Attis, which occurred at Rome at the height of Cybele's popularity. We see that many of the Dionysian/Great Mother festivals and their mystery rites have in common these features. A. Intoxication. B. A drama involving the ascent of a mock king or god upon a tree or symbolic axis. C. A sacrifice or mutilation. D. A frenzied lamentation followed by E. An eventual resurrection of the sacrificed body. I argue that these rituals were made up of fundamentally shamanic themes, and that it's even possible that they stemmed from the ritual process of extirpating, hanging, drying, tearing apart, and eating a mushroom around its host tree. Alright, well, that does it for the shameless self-plugging. Hopefully, if that all sounds intriguing to you, you'll go and check it out. Much of what I say in there is buttressed by what I say in this lecture series, and vice versa, so it's worth your time. There's a million footnotes and a fat bibliography at the back as well if you're also interested in doing your own research. So that's it for today. I'd like to thank you for joining me. I'm Dan Atrell, and if you want more information, you can visit my website at themodernhermeticist.com. See you next time.